Oh, well, thanks everyone for coming along and having me remotely. Very excited to be presenting to you tonight. So like Anki said, my name's Max. I'm a Flutter GD based here down south in Melbourne. So I'm just going to have a quick chat to you tonight about what's new in Flutter and Dart. As Anki mentioned, I'm going to be talking mostly about Flutter, but also a little bit about Dart, but also, first off, there's always the big elephant in the room. I basically get it every year. It's like anytime there's any changes in the Flutter team at Google, or Google like doesn't make a huge number of Flutter announcements at I/O, it's always like, oh, Flutter's dead. That's it. No more Flutter this year. And I've been doing Flutter for about 5 years now. It's almost the 10th birthday of Flutter. So Dash is getting towards being a teenager soon, and each year we basically get the same thing, and each year Flutter still comes back and has lots of new features, which I'll be talking about tonight. So yeah, like don't see it going away anywhere soon. It's actually going from strength to strength. I believe it's now the top or the second topmost project on GitHub, and as Mark Twain said, its death has been exaggerated. Actually, Mark Twain was, as I pointed out, was quoted. So it's not actually Mark Twain's quote. What he actually said was, the report of my death was an exaggeration. And I think the report of Dash's or Flutter's death is definitely an exaggeration, as it keeps being every year. So now that we've got that out of the way, what's actually new in the latest stable release of Flutter 3.2? Actually, after Anki did his show of hands, could I have a show of hands who uses Flutter or is like familiar with Flutter, just to give me a rough idea of where to pitch the talk? Oh, great. Excellent. Good to see so many hands. So this is the latest stable release that came out while Google I/O was on last week. So for those of you who may have seen the keynotes from Google I/O or seen some of the press, basically everything's Gemini. Like what I said before was actually wrong. Every technology except Gemini is now dead. There's just Gemini, more Gemini, lots more Gemini. Gemini is like the main model, the main machine learning model from Google. So everything is just like Gemini. I think whether it was Gemini or AI, Sundar, who's the CEO of Google, said it like about 200 times or something. It's just like everywhere. So given that everything's to do with Gemini, I feel like I'll be kicked out of the GD program if I don't at least talk about how Gemini relates to Flutter at the moment. So no, in all seriousness, Gemini is pretty cool. Like the main thing is it's now got a 1 million token context, and they're promising 2 million soon. Context is just like how many tokens you can give the model to base its answers on when you ask it things. And in terms of Flutter, we've got like actually 2 SDKs. So there's the initial SDK that Google put out a little while ago. There's documentation for that. There's a quick start guide on how to use that. Now there's also Gemini support in Firebase that has its own Dart SDK, and that's really handy if you are actually looking to start using this in production, because Firebase, the Vertex AI in Firebase is really like a productized version of this. So if you're ready to actually start going from prototypes to production, they recommend you use Vertex AI as a starting point. So there's an Dart SDK for that you can go read up on. Likewise, one of the other Gemini announcements was Gemini Nano, which is their little model that they're planning to have run on device. So on device in this case means Android and specifically Pixel devices. So there's not yet a Flutter plugin for that, but I imagine that's coming very soon, because even Nano isn't, I think, widely available yet for people to use. I think it's just about to be so. So I can't expect there'll be a Flutter plugin for people to use it on Android Pixel devices in the very near future. So that's got all our machine friends topics out the way. So I'll move on to what I'm actually excited about in the new Flutter release, and that's WebAssembly support. So it's WebAssembly, for those of you who don't know, is kind of like a low-level way of running things in web browsers, primarily at fairly high speeds, but rather than having to compile into JavaScript, which up till WebAssembly came along was the only way things ran in a web browser. You had to either have JavaScript or compile your favorite language like Dart to JavaScript, or you didn't run in browsers. But WebAssembly changes that now, and with the introduction of something called WebAssembly GC, garbage collection, it means a whole slew of languages like Dart and also Kotlin for our Android friends can now compile in a much more efficient manner to WebAssembly. And so Flutter is now shipping stable support, or sorry, is shipping support for it in a stable channel in the 3.2.2 release. So some initial benchmarks that the Flutter team and Google mentioned they've done with specifically Chrome on macOS show 2 to 3 times the frame rendering speed, which is awesome. Like basically that means you go from, say, taking 20 milliseconds to render a single frame, which means that you're going to have jank and stuttering, to 10 milliseconds, which means you're under the 16 millisecond limit and you get nice, buttery smooth 60 frames per second smooth animations and scrolling on mobile devices as well as on desktops. So that's awesome to see. However, with all the big announcements, there's always a but, and the but here is that in order to be able to support WebAssembly, what the Dart and Flutter teams needed to do was to change the way that Dart interoperates with JavaScript. So how it's able to call any JavaScript libraries or browser APIs that it needs to use, which means that now any plugins that your app uses when it's running as WebAssembly in a browser need to support that. So like for instance, a commercial product that I work on has, I think, 3 or 4 plugins that we rely on that are not yet supporting this new JavaScript interop framework that is required to use WebAssembly. So it means we can't ship with our Flutter web app as WebAssembly until all those plugin dependencies also support this new JavaScript API. Hopefully that's going to happen fairly quickly. It's happened in the past when, for instance, Dart moved to having null safety. All the packages and plugins had to be updated to that, and that happened in very quick order. So I'm quite confident that packages and plugin authors will pick that up and migrate that. But as of today, there are still a bunch that aren't available. So if you're wanting to try this out, it's probably good to start with a little small test or hobby project and just give it a bit of time for all the various plugins to be ported across this new JavaScript API, and then we'll all be in the happy world of running our Flutter apps really smoothly and quickly in browsers using WebAssembly. Now, the other big announcement was Impeller. Now, for those of you who aren't super familiar with Flutter, Impeller is the rendering engine inside Flutter. Previously, Flutter, or even it still does in some cases, uses the Skier graphics rendering engine, which is what's inside Chrome. So when you use Chrome, Chrome uses the Skier engine to basically draw stuff on the screen when you're looking at web pages. And that's the library that Flutter has used for a long time. But a few years ago, the Flutter team noticed that there were limitations to what they could do using Skier. So they started building their own purpose-built engine called Impeller. And as of, I think, 2 releases ago, it's been the default for iOS, but Android support was kind of like second cab off the rank. And now finally, they've at least got to the point where a preview is available in the stable channel. Currently, it's only for Vulkan Android devices. Vulkan is the replacement for OpenGL on Android. That's basically a technology that the phone uses to draw to the screen, or especially for apps that need to draw to the screen, that's how they talk to the GPU inside your device, be it phone or desktop, but primarily here we're talking about mobile devices and phones especially. So for now, it's only newer devices that support Vulkan. Although these days, because things are moving along, more people upgrade their phones, more and more devices are supporting it. And in fact, at I/O, one thing that the Android team mentioned is they're looking to move to just supporting Vulkan, and they're actually coming up with a way of basically having backwards compatibility by having OpenGL on Vulkan. So really, Vulkan is the future. For those of you who know a bit about iOS, their libraries or their framework's called Metal, and they basically completely switched to that. And for Android, Vulkan's the future. So for the time being, this is using Impeller as an opt-in. So the Flutter team's asking people to opt in if they can, give them feedback on what works, where there are issues, and then what they're planning is for later in the year for the Vulkan to be, or Impeller, I should say, to become the default. But what will happen is if your app is running on a device that supports Vulkan, it'll use that and it'll use Impeller. If not, it'll just fall back to the current older way of rendering. So it's not that your Flutter apps won't work on older Android devices, they'll just fall back to the less efficient, slightly slower way of drawing to the screen. And finally, for those of you who might be doing Flutter development, one thing that's good to know is that there's already initial test support, so you can even run your on-device tests with Impeller enabled to check out whether it's all working correctly, or if it's not, file bugs in the Flutter GitHub repo. Now, moving on to fixes for various things in Flutter. One thing the Flutter team discovered was that with some recent changes in Android 14, platform views, what I mean by that is a web view, so like a built-in web browser inside your app, or other native platform views, like say, for instance, maps in a Flutter app on Android 14 had some issues. So 3.22 brings a fix to that. So definitely worthwhile if you are shipping a Flutter app to update to Flutter 3.22 so you can pick up those fixes. They also have made some significant performance improvements for the other side of the fence for iOS with when you're using platform views in your Flutter app for that. So again, worthwhile keeping up to date and building your Flutter app with the latest stable version of the SDK. The nice thing about Flutter versus perhaps people who may have done similar development in the React world is updating to the latest version of Flutter SDKs is really clean and simple and easy. So unless you have some very specific reasons not to, it's really a good idea to keep up with at least the latest version of each stable Flutter release that comes out. And because primarily, you're not only picking up performance improvements, you're picking up bug fixes, and you're also often getting new features as well. Now, as we're talking about performance improvements, there's a few more that have come along and now we're getting sort of a bit into the weeds of, I guess, Flutter performance. One thing that they've improved inside their Impeller engine is how they implement blurring. Now, that might not seem to be such a big thing, but the thing is, if you look closely, you'll probably find that most mobile apps use blurring in some parts of the user interface. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's less subtle, but it's very commonly used. So getting good performance for blurring is actually quite important. And also, it's often quite a heavy operation in terms of the GPU. So getting this performance improvement is quite useful for Flutter developers. Also, they've switched to something called stencil then cover rendering, which, to be honest, I had to look up. I didn't really even know what on earth that was, but basically it's without going into really low-level details, it's just basically a way of improving the way that they render animations which have complex paths. So they've got a really nice little demonstration of this, showing Lottie animation and how much smoother it is. Lottie, for those of you who don't do mobile dev a lot, is a library that lets you import animations, and it's widely used both in native Android, iOS, and Flutter, even on the web. So improvements in that really are quite useful when a lot of mobile apps will be having parts of the UI display Lottie animations. Often this is useful perhaps onboarding screens, or like parts of your UI where you want to show some like help animations, or just make bits of your UI look that extra bit special. So having much better performance for this is, again, going to be like one of those improvements in terms of people building apps in Flutter. Now, there's a lot of little smaller things that they've announced. I guess the bigger of the smaller things that I picked up on is that DevTools, which is the web-based tool that Flutter developers use as a important means of debugging applications. Like, it's got things that help you debug the performance of your app, like you can debug network operations and so forth. Well, what the Flutter team have done is actually allowed now third-party developers, i.e. us, like people outside the Flutter team, to build extensions to DevTools. And the open source game engine Flame, which is basically the way you build games if you want to build games on top of Flutter, have built their own DevTools extension. It looks quite cool. They did a little demo of it at I/O. So if you're interested in that, I'd highly recommend checking it out. It's just one of those quality of life improvements that will make life that bit nicer for us who do Flutter development on a daily basis. A bunch of other small announcements they had was there's been improvements with Ads SDK. I don't do much with ads myself, but anyone who does ads will find that useful. There's a deep link validation tool, which is useful for a lot of developers, because most apps that I've worked on in the past have some sort of deep linking support, and it's often hard to get it right. So having an extra tool to help with that is handy. One newer feature in Android is predictive back gesture support. And now that's available in Flutter apps, though it is what they call behind a flag, which means you have to add like a flag on the command line to enable support for that in your app. But if that's something you need, it's there now and you can test it out. And finally, as with all things, they who giveth sometimes taketh away. And for us to be able to keep getting new features, the Google team at some point need to be able to deprecate or remove support for things. So in this case, one thing that's going is support for Android KitKat. Now, Android KitKat is not quite as ancient as I am, but it's getting on. So I don't think there are really that many devices out there that people might still be using that are running KitKat. So I suspect it's not going to be a big deal for most people, but yep, support for KitKat is going away. Now, onto the Dart portion of what's new. So Dart is released it's for those of you who don't do Flutter or who are new to Flutter, Dart is the programming language that Flutter apps are built in. Dart is released at roughly the same times as Flutter has their stable releases. So Dart 3.4 joins Flutter 3.2.2 as being released last week. Now, for the computer programming language geeks or nerds amongst us, macros are considered a really valuable thing. Macros are ways of doing metaprogramming. So basically modifying the programming language that you're using to do your app or app development. Now, in Dart, so I should say macros mean different things in different languages. In Dart, macros will mean that you get compile time code generation. So you're able to basically generate code at the same time that the code you've written is being compiled by the Dart compiler. And if that's a bit of a mouthful, well, it is. But it just basically means that boilerplate code, things that you wish you didn't have to write yourself, the compiler can now do that for you just by you adding some annotations in the code that you're writing by hand. For those of you who do Flutter development, you probably are thinking, well, that's not nothing new. There's already something called Build Runner, which does that for us. Unfortunately, Build Runner is kind of like an add-on, and it's actually also very slow. So the nice thing with macro support coming to Dart is that they will be inside the compiler. So it'll mean that this code generation happens really fast, and it's very nicely integrated into the existing tooling. So it works really well. At least in the demo that they showed us, it was like it got cheers and applause. People were really happy in the audience when they saw the demo of this at the I/O talk. Now, initially, the Dart team's just going to roll out one thing using macros, which is one macro to do JSON serialization, deserialization. This is kind of like probably the most common use of macros that's going to be out there. It's almost like a hello world of this sort of functionality. So it makes sense that they're rolling this out first. They're trying to go very slowly and tentatively because this is such a huge change to the Dart programming language. But they've mentioned that other things like data classes, which people who may have done Kotlin or Swift would be familiar with, will likely be coming down the track. But the end game is to support user macros. That's kind of like the final goal, which will mean anyone who's using Dart to write their Flutter apps can create macros to basically generate any kind of boilerplate that they want to have the compiler create for them rather than laboriously writing out by hand. This opens up to basically you creating customizations of the Dart programming language for whatever kind of tasks you're working on, which is awesome. But it's a little bit down the track. This is a really big change to the language, probably the last big change that's going to happen in the near future. And so they're quite obviously trying to not rush it and making sure that they get it right from the beginning. Now, actually, in terms of Dart itself, like I talked about WebAssembly in Flutter, well, Dart is the actual programming language for Flutter, and so it has support for WebAssembly, not just for Flutter, but just for what are called pure Dart web applications. You can actually use just Dart by itself without Flutter to write web apps as well. Now, the Dart team have said that this is experimental for now. The problem is that the tooling's not quite finished yet. There's a few little kind of annoyances and sharp edges, so that's why they've marked it experimental. But it's ready there for people to play around with, especially people who would like to use this for writing web applications using Dart, but not using Flutter, because not all web applications make sense to be Flutter applications. Now, the other proviso is that there's no support for non-JavaScript WebAssembly runtimes. What does that mean? That's another kind of mouthful. Essentially, WebAssembly, while it started off being primarily for web browsers, has found like actually quite a lot of use cases on the server side because it provides a lot of useful functionality that people actually want to use on the server and backends as well as in web browsers. And unfortunately, while the Dart team wants to support that eventually, there's not support for it yet. They do have a tracking issue for it. They've said that they are going to work on it, but it's not available at the moment, much to the disappointment of myself and some others who actually have some really pressing use cases where this would be super useful to have. I actually did a talk last year at our Melbourne DevFest about using Dart on the server side. And if you're interested to find out why you might want to use WebAssembly on the server side with Dart, I'll plug my own talk and say, look that up on YouTube, because that'll give you an idea of what the possibilities are for using Dart compiled to WebAssembly, not just in web browsers, but also for server-side applications. And apart from that, there wasn't that much else on the Dart side of things. This is just me. I don't work for Google. This is just me picking up on the vibe, on the feel, on the gist of it, talking to people at I/O. Is that like it seems that WebAssembly and macros are really like big things that are taking up a lot of the Dart team's time and resources. So I expect as they get on top of this, other things will be coming along. But for the time being, these are the really two big efforts that they're making in terms of the Dart language and improving it at the moment. So if you want to learn, like I've tried to cover everything that was in 3.2.2 for Flutter and 3.4 for Dart, but there's lots of details that I just don't have the time to cover in my talk today. So if anyone who wants to dig further in, there's a great post on Medium by one of the product managers for the Flutter team, which goes into a lot more detail. There's some nice graphics, some good charts. So look that up if you want to get more details on the things I've mentioned in my talk tonight. And with that, I think I can pretty much wrap it up and ask if there's any questions, if it's possible, Anki, or maybe I've gone over time. We'll see. Let's see what Anki says. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Max. That's fine. So I think we have time for questions. Any questions?
Hi. Actually, I wanted to ask about the Flutter SEO side, like when we develop web application based on Flutter. So currently, I haven't found a good resource where we can develop a strongly SEO website based on Flutter.
Okay, yes, that's a very good question. And that's one of the reasons I mentioned like pure Dart web apps, because to be honest, like the Flutter team does, or like people who use Flutter in general do say that you want to pick the right tool for the right job. And I think Flutter is very good for web apps, but it's not so good for websites. I think that's an important distinction to make, is so that's why there's not really much in the way of SEO support in terms of Flutter apps, because Flutter really is geared towards doing web apps versus websites. Now, what I mean by that is say something like Gmail or Figma or similar tools like that. Those are web apps. They're basically applications that happen to run in your web browser. Or whereas websites, you might think of as something like, I don't know, The Age or like Qantas's website. Those are more websites, or Wikipedia. So for those kind of websites where SEO is important, I think Flutter is probably, and like I'm saying this is a big Flutter proponent, not a good choice to use that. So whereas for web apps, I think usually SEO is not really a big concern, because it's an app. Like people have found your web app because they want to use that tool, in which case like that's where Flutter works well, but that's where possibly SEO is not that big a deal, because your primary kind of like product site, I would say build it in something other than Flutter. So that would be my recommendation. Flutter is really not the best choice to say build a product information site or like a documentation website. It's not the greatest tool for that.
Okay, thanks. Maybe one more question. Sorry.
Yes, thanks. Please use the mic. It's much easier to hear with the mic.
Thank you. Just a Dart on a server. I just wondered where the WebAssembly angle comes in on that, because I thought just compiling Dart would be the way to go for best performance on the server.
Yes, it is. So this is like, so there's in fact already at least 3, maybe 4 frameworks for doing server-side Dart. So definitely WebAssembly isn't required to be able to do it. But my personal kind of reason for using Dart on server-side is to actually build very robust, very fault-tolerant applications, because Dart actually has a great feature called isolates, which are what other languages like Erlang have as well. It's what's called the actor model, which means that you... Oh, did I break up?
Just a moment.
Sorry. Oh, fantastic NBN. Oh, I was just going to say, so yeah, there's these things called isolates in Dart, which provide basically concurrency, but in a very safe manner, because they don't have any shared memory, and they also support asynchronous messaging, which means like you don't get deadlocks or race conditions. And for that, WebAssembly would be fantastic, because it's the missing piece that Dart doesn't have right now, which is the ability to essentially safely stop running code or dynamically load at runtime code. Those are the two features that are kind of missing that for something like Erlang has that Dart doesn't have. So once we get support for WebAssembly on the backend for Dart, it's kind of like the last few missing pieces that would make Dart basically, in my view anyway, a premier backend language along the lines of Erlang or Go for those people who are familiar with those languages. And for instance, Go is, I think, pardon the pun, Google's go-to language for backend development. And it's widely used in many other organizations as well for most of their backend development. So for me, as a proponent of Dart on the backend or on server-side development, like getting these last missing pieces of the puzzle would, I think, make it like a star alternative to things like Go or Erlang for a lot of applications that need very robust services.